There are moments in tennis when a player wins a match, moments when a player wins a title, and then there are moments when the entire atmosphere around a tournament begins to change because one player has arrived. For Alex Eala, that moment may have come before she even stepped onto the court in Cincinnati. Behind the scenes at the Cincinnati Open, one of the most powerful figures in American tennis had reportedly pulled the 21-year-old Filipina sensation aside for a private conversation, and what he told her was not the kind of message a young player forgets. Ben Navarro, the billionaire owner of the Cincinnati Open and the father of American star Emma Navarro, had been watching Alex's extraordinary rise with growing interest. But this was not simply a tournament owner welcoming another seeded player. Navarro had seen what Alex had done in Toronto. He had seen the 30-minute ticket sellouts. He had watched thousands of Filipino fans turn the SoFi Stadium into what felt like Little Manila. He understood that Alex was no longer simply another name in a draw. She had become a phenomenon. And now, as the newly transformed Lindner Family Tennis Center prepared to host one of the biggest events on the WTA calendar, Navarro reportedly delivered a message that carried enormous weight. You are the story of this tournament. Think about what that means. The owner of the tournament, a billionaire who had committed hundreds of millions of dollars to building a new future for Cincinnati tennis, was telling a 21-year-old player that her presence had become part of the story he wanted the world to see. And the timing could not have been more dramatic. Cincinnati had just undergone a staggering $260 million transformation, with Navarro personally covering around half of the cost. The Lindner Family Tennis Center had expanded from roughly 20 acres to more than 40 acres. 13 new courts had been added. A new 2,300-seat sunken stadium had been constructed. A massive player clubhouse and indoor tennis facilities had transformed the site into one of the most ambitious venues on the tour. This was no longer the Cincinnati Open people remembered. This was a statement, a declaration that Cincinnati intended to stand among the greatest tennis destinations in the world. And now, standing at the center of that new era, was Alex. The world had already watched her create history. She had become the first Filipina to win a WTA Tour singles title in Washington. She had reached the 4th round of Wimbledon. She had climbed rapidly through the rankings. She had electrified Toronto with a wave of Filipino support that seemed to grow with every match. And now she was arriving in Cincinnati as a seeded player, receiving a first-round bye and carrying the expectations of an entire nation. But there was another layer to this story, one that made Navarro's private conversation even more intriguing. His daughter, Emma Navarro, was also in the draw. Suddenly, this was not just the story of a tournament owner recognizing a rising star. It was the story of a father watching a player who could potentially face his own daughter. The possibility of an Alex Eala Emma Navarro showdown became one of the intriguing storylines surrounding the tournament. Two young players. Two rising names. Two athletes trying to establish themselves among the best in the world. And yet, according to the source story, Navarro's admiration for Alex went far beyond the possibility of a future match. He had been watching the numbers. He had been watching the crowds. He had been watching the reaction. In Toronto, tickets for Alex's opening appearance had reportedly disappeared in just 30 minutes. Thousands of Filipino fans had flooded the stadium, creating an atmosphere that transformed a tennis match into something much larger. Navarro, a businessman who understood the economics of sport, could see what many people were only beginning to understand. Alex did not simply bring a racket and a ranking. She brought an audience. She brought emotion. She brought a global Filipino community that was willing to travel, buy tickets, fill stadiums, wave flags, and turn ordinary sessions into unforgettable events. And Cincinnati was ready to capitalize on that energy. The tournament had not spent $260 million simply to make the grounds look better. The goal was to create a destination capable of attracting the biggest names, the biggest crowds, and the biggest moments in tennis. The transformation was enormous. The grounds had doubled in size. 13 new courts had been added. A 2,300-seat sunken stadium had become part of the new landscape. A 56,000-square-foot player clubhouse and a 53,000-square-foot indoor tennis center had elevated the facility into a modern tennis complex designed around the players and the future of the event. Even the game's biggest stars had noticed. World number 1 Aryna Sabalenka had reportedly described the upgrades as insane, saying the venue felt like a completely different tournament. Venus Williams, returning to Cincinnati for the first time since 2023, called it tennis paradise. Those comments mattered because they confirmed what Navarro had been trying to build. But every great venue needs a great story. Every new stage needs a performer capable of making people care. And as Alex arrived in Cincinnati, it appeared that the tournament had found exactly the kind of player it needed. The story becomes even more remarkable when you look at Navarro's decision to keep Cincinnati at the center of his vision. When he purchased the Cincinnati Open from UTA in 2022, he acquired one of the most valuable properties in professional tennis, a license connected to one of the 6 combined top-level events outside the Grand Slams. There were other possibilities. Charlotte, a growing city nearly 3 times the size of Cincinnati, had made a proposal. Chicago offered the appeal of a massive tennis market. On paper, there were plenty of reasons to move. Instead, Navarro doubled down on Mason, Ohio, a city of roughly 36,000 people better known to many outsiders for its roller coasters than its tennis. It was a gamble. A massive one. But Navarro decided Cincinnati was worth building around. The result was an unprecedented $260 million renovation and expansion of the Lindner Family Tennis Center, with Navarro covering approximately half of the cost himself. The grounds grew from 20 acres to more than 40. 13 new courts were added. The facility gained a 2,300-seat sunken stadium, a 56,000-square-foot clubhouse, a 53,000-square-foot indoor tennis center, and a new operations center. The tournament itself was changing too. What had once been a one-week event was expanding to 12 days. The player fields grew from 56 to 96. The ambition was no longer simply to host a great tournament. Cincinnati wanted to create an experience. Bob Moran, the tournament director and an executive at Navarro's investment company, explained the thinking behind the transformation by describing how a smaller investment in 2024 produced a dramatic difference from the previous year, leading the team to realize that they could truly make the project work in Cincinnati. And the players began validating that belief. Sabalenka, seeing the transformation firsthand, reportedly arrived for a pre-tournament round and reacted with disbelief, saying she had initially wondered what was happening and where she was. She explained that it had taken her time to feel comfortable at the previous venue, but now it felt like an entirely different tournament. Venus Williams went even further, calling the new environment tennis paradise. These were not minor compliments. They were signs that Navarro's gamble was beginning to pay off. But the biggest test was still ahead. Because the true measure of a tournament is not the size of its buildings. It is the moments those buildings create. And Alex Eala was arriving at precisely the right time. The private conversation between Navarro and Alex therefore takes on another meaning. It was not simply about money. It was not simply about hospitality. It was recognition. Recognition that a young player from the Philippines had created something that could not be manufactured with a construction budget. She had created demand. She had created emotion. She had created a connection between a player and a fan base that extended far beyond the traditional tennis audience. Navarro had built the stage. Alex was bringing the people. And the numbers surrounding the tournament made the opportunity impossible to ignore. The Cincinnati Open's women's prize pool was listed in the source at approximately $7.43 million, making it one of the most lucrative stops on the WTA calendar. The singles champion was set to receive $752,275, while the runner-up would take home $391,600. The source also listed significant financial rewards for players advancing through the later rounds, with Alex's projected fourth-round position carrying a substantial payday and further advancement bringing even greater rewards. For Alex, however, the money was only one part of the equation. The ranking points were arguably even more important. As a seeded player with a first-round bye, every victory in Cincinnati offered another opportunity to strengthen her position in the world rankings and build momentum heading toward the US Open. This was the stage where reputations could change in a matter of days. One deep run could transform a ranking. One victory over a major opponent could alter the perception of a player. And Alex had already demonstrated that she was capable of defeating players who once seemed far beyond her reach. Her Washington title had changed the trajectory of her season. Her Wimbledon run had added another layer to her growing reputation. Toronto had shown the commercial and emotional force of her popularity. Cincinnati now offered the chance to prove that none of it was a coincidence. But there was another number that made the story even more striking: the money Alex had already earned in Toronto. Her National Bank Open campaign reportedly brought her $89,700 in total prize money, including $81,800 from singles and $7,900 from doubles alongside Venus Williams. That total represented more than 5.4 million Philippine pesos. Cincinnati offered the possibility of dramatically exceeding that figure. Yet if you looked only at the prize money, you were missing the real story. Alex was not walking into Cincinnati chasing a check. She was walking into a new chapter of her career. The girl who once dreamed simply of becoming a professional tennis player was now entering a tournament where the owner himself reportedly believed she was one of the main stories. And that is what makes the private conversation with Navarro so powerful. Imagine being 21 years old, arriving at one of the biggest tournaments of your career, knowing that the billionaire who owns the event has watched your rise, studied the crowds following you, understood your commercial impact, and then tells you that you are the story of his tournament. There is pressure in that statement. But there is also belief. For Alex, the response could only be the same response that has carried her through every difficult moment. Stay focused, keep fighting, and let the tennis speak. Because once the lights come on, the billionaire disappears into the crowd. The owner cannot hit the forehand. The money cannot serve the ace. The renovation cannot save a match point. The only thing that matters is the player standing on the other side of the net. And Alex knew that. She had learned that pressure does not disappear when expectations grow. It simply changes shape. The question was no longer whether she belonged on a big stage. She had already answered that in Washington, at Wimbledon, and in Toronto. The question was how far she could take this new version of herself. The version that was no longer simply a promising young player from the Philippines, but a seeded WTA star with a growing global audience and a tournament owner publicly recognizing her importance to his event. The Cincinnati Open had transformed itself physically. Alex was transforming herself competitively. And those two transformations were now colliding at exactly the right moment. The tournament had grown from 20 acres to more than 40. The draw had expanded from 56 players to 96. The event had grown from 1 week to 12 days. New stadiums had been built. New courts had been added. New facilities had been created. The world's best players were arriving. Sabalenka was there. Elena Rybakina was there. Jessica Pegula was there. Coco Gauff was there. Iga Swiatek was there. Naomi Osaka was there. Venus Williams had returned. And among all those names, one of the biggest stories was a 21-year-old Filipina who had become impossible to ignore. Alex did not need to be the loudest player in the tournament. Her fans were already doing that for her. She did not need to convince people that Filipino tennis mattered. The crowds had already done that. She simply needed to play. But sometimes the hardest thing in sports is playing when everyone suddenly expects you to become the story. The pressure can be enormous. 1 week you are the underdog. The next, you are the player everyone wants to see. 1 month you are chasing the rankings. The next, you are being seeded among the world's elite. 1 tournament you are fighting for recognition. The next, a billionaire tournament owner is telling you that your presence matters to the future of his event. That is the strange speed of professional tennis. Careers can change almost overnight. And Alex's career was changing quickly. Her journey from the basketball courts of her childhood to the biggest tennis stages in the world had already been extraordinary. The source describes a young girl associated with ruffled socks and light-up shoes, a player whose story began far away from the billionaire boardrooms and multi-million-dollar stadium renovations surrounding her now. Yet here she was, standing inside a $260 million vision, entering a tournament that had been rebuilt for the future, carrying the hopes of Filipino fans who had followed her across continents, and receiving the attention of the man who had built the stage. That is why Navarro's private conversation matters, because it symbolized a shift. Alex was no longer asking the tennis world to notice her. The tennis world was beginning to ask what would happen next. The owner had noticed. The fans had noticed. The players had noticed. The tournament had noticed. And now the only question remaining was whether Alex could turn all that attention into another unforgettable run. The irony was impossible to miss. The father of one of her potential opponents was telling her that she was the story of the tournament. The same tournament where his daughter was competing. The same tournament where Alex was seeded and given a first-round bye. The same tournament that had become one of the biggest infrastructure projects in American tennis. And somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the billionaire investments, beyond the enormous prize pool, there was still the simple truth of tennis. 2 players, 1 court, 1 ball, and no room to hide. If Alex eventually faced Emma Navarro, everything surrounding the story would disappear for those 2 hours. There would be no $260 million renovation. No billionaire owner. No Filipino diaspora. No ticket sales. No headlines. Just competition. That is what makes tennis so brutal and so beautiful. The stage can be enormous, but the moment itself is incredibly small. A serve. A return. A break point. A tiebreak. 1 decision. 1 swing. 1 point that can change everything. And Alex had built her reputation by embracing those moments. She had already shown that she could withstand pressure. She had already shown that she could fight through adversity. She had already shown that she could walk into arenas filled with expectations and still find a way to compete. Cincinnati was simply offering her a bigger stage. A much bigger one. The prize money was bigger. The ranking implications were bigger. The audience was bigger. The expectations were bigger. But perhaps most importantly, the belief around her was bigger. Navarro's reported message was not a prediction that Alex would win the tournament. It was something more interesting. It was an acknowledgement that she had already become part of the tournament's identity. And for a player still only 21 years old, that is a remarkable place to be. Cincinnati had spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars building a new identity. Alex had spent her entire life building hers. Now those stories were meeting. The billionaire owner had built the stage. The WTA had brought the world's best. The fans had brought the energy. And Alex had brought the story. As the first round approached, the conversation was no longer simply about whether she could survive another tournament. It was about whether she could continue the momentum that had carried her from Washington to Wimbledon to Toronto and now into Cincinnati. Could she climb even higher? Could she turn another strong run into another ranking breakthrough? Could she make another statement before the US Open? Could she justify the belief of the fans who had followed her across the world? And could she prove that the billionaire tournament owner was right when he told her that she was the story? There was only one way to find out. She had to walk onto the court. She had to pick up the racket. She had to face whoever stood across the net. And she had to do what Alex Eala had been doing all year, compete without fear. Because the greatest stories in tennis are rarely written by the person who owns the stadium. They are written by the player who walks into it and makes the stadium remember her name. Cincinnati had spent $260 million building a new future. Alex had spent years building toward her own. Now, under the lights of the newly transformed Lindner Family Tennis Center, those futures were about to collide. The billionaire owner had made his investment. The tournament had built its stage. The fans were ready. The world's best were waiting. And Alex Eala was standing at the center of it all. The girl from Quezon City who had once dreamed of making history was no longer waiting for her moment. She had arrived at one of the biggest stages in tennis, and the man who owned that stage had already told her exactly what he believed. She was the story. Now it was time for Alex to write the next chapter herself. This is Courtroom Tennis, and the story of Alex Eala's rise is only getting started.